Yeah, I feel like this letter that we're reading is like so important for where we're at right now as a society. Like this, we're so polarized in the way that we believe that things should be, and there's Christians against Christians, and then there's people against Christians, and there's Christians against people, and it's just like, it's really volatile right now in this world. And I think that this letter has a lot to teach us, and that we have so much to learn. So yeah, and just like you were saying, there was huge conflict between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians because of the way that they believed how God was required to be worshipped, and they could not see eye to eye on those things. And when you don't see eye to eye with other Christians, what do? Peace out instead of working it out. You're like, I'm not going to engage here. This is too much. So definitely, that's a theme in life in general. But yeah, thanks, Rose. Anything else that you guys are seeing? Yeah, Georgia.
I have a question about why it says a righteousness that is by faith from first to last.
Yeah.
I'm not quite, like, maybe that's just to extend it from the beginning to the end of time, but I was just a little bit confused.
Yeah, so it's also translated in my Bible. There's like this little letter of E next to it, and it says from faith to faith. And there's a lot of different ideas of what that means from different people, but it could mean what you were just saying. It could mean almost like a faith that piles on top of a faith, so it's like an abundance of faith. But basically, I think what Paul's explaining is that the righteousness, which is kind of a big churchy word, it's not a word that we use very often. So when I think of righteousness, I think like the goodness of God, or like the wholeness, like things feel totally right. So that is like this sense of wholeness, which we talk about with shalom here a lot. So it comes from faith, from the sense of trusting in God. So when we trust in God and we place our faith in God, there's this goodness that we are compelled to live into in this world, to make this world more whole and healthy. That's how I would see it, but there's lots of different ideas out there too. Yeah. All right, well, I'm going to bring what God has for us today that I feel like God brought for us. If anything comes up, interrupt me, raise your hand. We can talk throughout the entire thing. The beauty of meeting together like this is that we get to learn from each other. I just have spent some time on it this week, so I feel like I can bring something, but we all have a word to bring of truth, encouragement. You might hear something that I'm saying, and you're like, that's not okay. We need to talk about that. I don't agree with that. This is supposed to be a community that we can challenge each other in and grow with each other in. So this letter that Paul wrote to the churches in Rome, oftentimes, in my experience, has kind of been distilled down to like doctrinal information to hand to people. So there's a doctrine of justification and of a doctrine of salvation or atonement or election and all these sorts of big churchy words that we kind of create a formulaic understanding of the gospel, of what it means to be saved by Jesus Christ. And so we've got the Roman road sort of mentality. We pull out 5 different verses in Romans and say, this is what it means to follow Jesus fully, instead of seeing the book or the letter as a whole. This letter has a lot of practical content about what it means to live a Christ-centered life, but that's not all it is. This letter is incredibly pastoral in nature. And we've read that just this morning with all this I language that Paul uses. I pray for you. I long for you. I serve you. I thank God for you. All this like I language that he's imparting into this letter. And because it's pastoral, it means that the people that were hearing everything else that comes next are being rooted in a space of feeling pastored and cared for. That the bearer of this letter is wanting to impart that the people there, the churches, are beloved by Paul and by God. Now, Paul wasn't able to get to Rome. He didn't get there for another 5 years. And so because he knew he wasn't going to be able to get there, he sent the letter ahead of himself. And instead of sending the letter ahead with a man like Silas, or not Silas, I know, me, Peter, or any other male voice, he chose the letter to be sent ahead of him by Phoebe. And Phoebe was a woman, and she then embodied the nature of Paul to the people. Paul wrote a letter that was pastoral for the people, and he sent it with Phoebe, because Phoebe, he knew, would be able to pastor the people really, really well. And women truly make great pastors. They just do. And even though for so long women have been kept from that sort of space, there's something very pastoral in the nature of what it means to be female. And so I think that Paul was very incredibly intentional on who he chose to be the bearer of this letter. He also is very intent on explaining how God is guiding him throughout everything, that he looks to God for such wisdom throughout his entire life. He's very clear in his mission in life with his intent of this letter, that he says that he is eager to preach the gospel to Rome for everyone. And he wants to preach it to the Jews and the Gentiles alike. Now this letter isn't going to all of Rome. It's really just staying put in the 5 or 6 house churches that Phoebe goes from one to the other and tells this letter, preaches this letter. And so for the people in this church, in these churches, most of them would have already heard the gospel. That's the reason that they were there in the first place. They would have heard and believed the gospel. So why would Paul want to preach the gospel to them? Well, for Paul, the gospel wasn't some equation to subscribe to. It wasn't some sort of evangelism talk that you could give in 5 minutes on a bus station stop so that you could share about who Jesus was with somebody as fast as possible. That was never the point for Paul's message of the gospel that God had given him. The gospel is the announcement of the good news of God's love for all people that was shown in the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But it was also an entirely new way to be human. The gospel was never meant to be distilled down to 4 verses or a paragraph of information to be swallowed and accepted. The gospel was a way of life. And for Paul, he didn't go into a city somewhere or onto some campus with a bullhorn and a sign trying to say, turn or burn or whatever it is that you would have heard people say. He didn't even end up going to a city for a day and stand on a street corner. That was never his mission. His entire mission was to move into a city, into a town, into a community, and settle there. He was always in a place for anywhere from a few months to a few years, because he knew that the gospel wasn't just an announcement. It was that. It was also an entire way of being. And in order to experience the gospel, we must be discipled in the ways of Jesus. So he knew that it was something more than just an announcement, that it was something that he wanted to live into. He babysat people's kids. He ate dinner for long evenings around new friends' tables. He experienced life. His life was the gospel message. And he was never distant from or protected from or removed from reality, like many people who are just sharing the message on the street corner with passerbys usually are. He wanted to know what people were like, and that's what it means to pastor people. The good news of God's love is in the real stuff of life. It is in the blood and the sweat. It is in the joys and the suffering and the messy parts of life. And for a pastor, the message that they preach should be most revealed in the way they live their day-to-day life. If a pastor spends most of their time preparing a sermon, which I do, I spend a lot of time preparing a sermon, but if I spend all of my time or most of my time holed up in an office somewhere, going over commentaries, trying to figure out how to give the best sermon of my life every week, and I'm actually missing the flesh and blood interactions with people, then am I actually pastoring you? Do I actually know you? And I want to be somebody, and a pastor should be somebody who is available for people, who is present. And when I'm not, then what am I ever able to offer besides just some sort of hierarchical, top-down message? A pastor is present, and that was what Paul was, even from a distance. And you could see that in the ways that he was just I pray for you. I don't even know most of you. I don't know your names. I don't know your lives, but I pray for you because God has placed you on my heart. I long to see you. I cannot wait to be with you so I can build you up and you can build me up in your love. Jason and I are leaving next week for a family gathering. My dad's turning 80, and he was raised in Long Island, and so all of his siblings are still there, so we're all going to Long Island for the week to celebrate my dad. And I am so excited to be with my family, to be able to see them again. It's been quite some time. Now, I am not telling them that I'm longing to see them because I'm going to give them some sort of wisdom from my life and they're just so happy to have me in their presence. It is because they build me up and I build them up. It is a mutual building of each other up. And for Paul, he saw the church of Rome, even though he didn't know them necessarily personally, besides a handful, he saw them as his family. When we're with family, it is a mutual building of each other up, of loving each other. And that was what Paul wanted to do more than anything. That's why he wanted to get to Rome so badly. And the good news of Jesus Christ that Paul wanted to impart to them through Christ's death and resurrection is that we have been saved. The powers of this world that corrupt and that cause decay and death have been overpowered by the love of God. When we give our lives over to Jesus, all of those powers are destroyed within us. That corruption and death and decay no longer dominate your life because of God's love. And this is, there are still realities that happen in our lives. There's still death and destruction. There's still things that we choose into our lives or things that happen to us that are horrible. That's still a reality. But those things no longer dominate our life because of Jesus Christ. This is what Paul wanted to impart to the people. And the truth of this, this brings me hope when I am hopeless. It brings me peace when my home feels totally chaotic and my life is totally chaotic. I was sharing earlier that literally I was like finishing my sermon last night. It was late at night. My kids aren't here today, so oh gosh, they should be here so I don't talk about them. This is why. And like things just felt out of control in my home. It was, my son has a lot of stomach issues that it's causing him to not really want to live right now. And my daughter was like literally threatening to move out. Like she's like, I'm going to run away. And I'm just like chaos everywhere. And I'm writing this out that, okay, Christ brings me peace when the life around me is chaotic. And I'm just like sinking into that truth because there's nothing more true than that. I have no control over the things that my kids do or the experiences I might have or what the future holds for me. I have no control there. And to believe that I have control is such a fallacy that I think the enemy just like keeps trying to convince me of. But the truth is that Christ brings me peace when the world around me feels absolutely chaotic. That is what the gospel brings. It brings me purpose when I wonder if anything I do matters, which I know all of us experience this from time to time. And Jesus reminds us that there is so much purpose to each of our lives, even when we question if anything that we do actually matters. The gospel of Jesus Christ is strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow. Last night we were after dinner. We were watching Obi-Wan Kenobi. We're late to the game, I know, but we're watching that with our kids, and it's actually really good. Anyway, Isaac was like saying, I'm still a little hungry, and Jason said, well, there's some pasta downstairs on the stove, and it needs to be warmed up, and you could put like a thing of pesto on it and mix it together, and that'll be great. So why don't you just turn on the stove and do that? And I'm telling him like, okay, these are the steps that you could do that, and he's just like, I can see him just going into his head, being like, oh my gosh, this is too much for me. I don't know if I can handle this. And we're like, okay, so step one, this. Step two, you stir it. You just monitor it. You make sure it doesn't burn. And he goes like, he says, I'm really uncomfortable with this, Mom. I don't know if I can do this. And I said, Isaac, I know you're uncomfortable with this, but I have faith in you. I trust that you're able to do this. And he says to me, I know that you have trusted me to do this. I don't have faith in myself, Mom. And I turned to Jason, and I was like, oh, that'll preach. That is absolutely true, because the gospel message is one where God says to you, I have faith in you. I believe and I trust that you as my people can live out a place of peace and joy and love and kindness in this world. And when you think that you can't do it, I have faith that you can. I believe that you are able. And maybe you might burn something on the stove sometimes. And maybe my spirit has to direct you step by step until it becomes more routine for you. But I have faith that you are able to do this, that you can work for justice, that you can stand for the oppressed and meet the needs of the hungry and the vulnerable, that you will get through this storm and chaos that is in your life right now, that you will experience the gospel message of Jesus that says that God trusts in your capabilities within a community Oftentimes, we believe that we are not capable, but as individuals in a community, we become incredibly capable. But even still, in our lack of faith in ourselves, God's message is one that still saves us when things feel really chaotic. Jay, do you have something to say?
Yeah, just someone shared something.
Yeah. Oh, I love that you could put it up there. I love verse 12 that says, when we get together, I want to encourage you in your faith, but also want to be encouraged by yours. I love this picture of interdependence we are called to have with one another. We are like different puzzle pieces that fit in with one another to enable us to see the big picture of God's love and purpose. We need one another to see the manifestation of this in our world. Yes, interdependence. Any other thoughts coming up yet? There's that famous verse in the scriptures that we just read where Paul says, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel, right? That's one that many of us have heard our entire lives. Paul says that he is not ashamed of the gospel, that he's proud to share it, that he's proud to live it out with the wider Jesus communities that were breaking forth within the world around him. In this world that Paul was writing to, it was a world marked by honor and shame, which is something that we also live into in many ways. It just might not be spoken of in that same sort of a way. But this sort of world where those with power or privilege, those who were educated or wealthy were honored, and those who were sexually ambiguous or disabled, poor, widowed, or enslaved, or even just uneducated were often shamed. And what was the most shameful thing ever? In this society, the most shameful thing was when someone was crucified, when they were killed for going against Rome. And that crucified person would then place shame on their entire family, on their friend circles. They would no longer be able to participate, the families would no longer be able to participate in society as a beloved member when their family member was crucified for Rome. So Paul was declaring that he is not ashamed of this crucified Jesus, but that his crucifixion showed God's power when he was raised from the dead. And that when Jesus was raised from the dead, friends, he was raised with all those shameful wounds and scars of his crucifixion still embedded into his skin. Scott McKnight, who writes this book called Reading Romans Backwards, which I would have put on the screen, but I didn't think we'd be in here, so I'm just going to read it to you. He says that Paul subverts the worldliness of the Roman Empire by believing and preaching in the lordship of the crucified Jesus. He is not one bit ashamed of that gospel. That gospel, furthermore, is taking root in Rome in small house churches, among the poor, among the low of status, and this kind of Christoformity subverts Roman flesh and empire ideology. How many of you have been to Rome before? You guys! Seriously! Oh, I want to go so bad. I'm really glad that you guys have all gone. You know, I'm just really happy for you. I'm really happy. So those of you who have gone to Rome, you already know this, but in Rome, to this day still, there is a river that runs through it that is called the Tiber River, and it kind of runs through the center of the city, and the city is built on a floodplain that still floods from time to time. So what you'd see when visiting Rome is that you'd see poorer neighborhoods around the floodplain down towards the lower parts of Rome, and those homes would be like really sandwiched close to each other, especially back in the earlier times of Roman history. So the poorer homes would be down near the floodplain. Further up would be a little bit more wealthier homes. And then up on the mountains, there's 7 hills of Rome that are kind of famous. And that is where the wealthiest people would live, up in those 7 wealthy hills. Caesar Augustus's home it took almost an entire hill of one of those. Nero was on another hill. And it was literally like a top-down hierarchy of power and influence that went from the top of the hills all the way down to that floodplain closest to the pain and vulnerability of everyday people. And it is in that place of everyday people, in those places of vulnerability, where those house churches were found. Most of them were in those sorts of floodplain areas. That is where Paul's letter was also found. Paul's letter didn't go into the houses of Rome where all the wealthy were. And it seems like, if we think of like how change happens. Change, it seems like most of the change for good could happen if it was coming from the top down, right? Like it seems like if the gospel was to make the most difference in the world, it should be taken up to those hills. It should be taken up to those palaces of influence. And the power of God should go to the powerful, because then they could get it out to people even faster, right? Yeah, I know. And you guys, we know that this isn't true. We know that the powerful places usually are fairly corrupted and fairly evil in some ways. And this has been a heavy week in our United States for a lot of us. It's been volatile. There's been an abundance of hatred and blame and fear, also celebration. There's been anxiety and arguments among friends and among family, among all sorts of people. And there's a reality, to some degree, friends, like we live in California, and not much has changed for us in California. So for some people, because there hasn't been much change, women's rights weren't taken away from people in California. So for some people, there's definitely a bit of relief. For other people, there might be a sense of like, well, I just can't really celebrate anything because nothing's changed in California. There's still lots of work to do, lots of things to be praying for. But regardless of how we feel as Californians, there's a reality that the rest of the United States is really feeling a lot of emotion. There's a level of charged emotion because of the empathy that you feel towards others who are experiencing certain things. You're incredibly affected by this. All of us have been incredibly affected by this, for good or for bad. And you might even think that other American rights are at risk, like gay marriage or contraception, interracial marriage. There's other things that might feel like they are teetering or on the brink of teetering. There are certain American rights that don't fit into the biblical understanding of what it means to be human, historically seen in the Bible. And some powerful Christians with money, influence, or political power, how they interpret and enforce the Bible on other people is incredibly frightening, and it is wrong. And we are seeing this in our world. A lot of different interpretations are in the Bible, friends. But for us to believe that we have the right interpretation and then enforce it on other people is not what Jesus came to do. Okay? There are certain things that are happening in this world that are a little bit frightening. Jesus was not born into places of political power or political influence. He wasn't raised on the hills of Rome. God could have absolutely sent him there. We have no doubt in our mind that God could have absolutely had Jesus born into the throne of Rome and into the places where there was major influence for Jesus. But instead of those hills of Rome, Jesus was born into some occupied and subjected area of Palestine. And if we are to follow Jesus, it means that Christian nationalism and political influence in high places of power should not be our mission. Our mission as people of Jesus Christ is to find the low places and meet those places in compassion and love. And the healthiest and most Christ-like movements of the church always happens at the bottom. And the moment that the institutional church strives for popularity, for political power, or for financial influence is the moment that the institutional church will find themselves manipulating and coercing and gaslighting people just to stay on top. And every one of us has experienced this. We've either experienced it personally or we have felt it, how Satan has tricked and convinced so many in believing that the gospel needs to go to places of power, that the best thing for Jesus is to get as many Christians to the top, because when they are in the top, then God's purposes are up there, and then we can force all of God's purposes on people for their good. And if they don't think it's a good thing, eventually they will. Yeah, Ed?
In that passage where Paul's talking about Greeks and non-Greeks, and then he refers after that to Greeks being wise, non-Greeks being barbaric.
Yeah.
And it seems like a real diss at Rome, which is seen as this intellectual center and things like this, and Greeks and are seen as the epitome of intellectual discourse and all that. And Paul's saying, no, it's the foolish as well. I mean, it's the people that don't have this education or something like that. It's for those that are considered non-wise or unwise.
Well, and the reality is that no one is unsusceptible to corruption. We are all susceptible to getting it wrong, no matter if we are the poorest of the poor or the wealthiest of the wealthy. That is just a reality. But oftentimes when we have that power at us or at our fingertips, we can be easily influenced by that power in many, many ways. I worry, and I think a lot of us here worry as well, that we're seeing this like hinting of a marriage of church and state. And in this hinting that I'm seeing that's happening, I'm also seeing a hardening of people's hearts towards Christ. There is this blanket hardening that I'm seeing in social media. I'm seeing it in friendships. People that are like, I don't know what to do with Jesus. I trust you as a Christian, but I don't like what's happening with Christians right now. I'm really afraid for myself because of how Christians are placing their beliefs on me right now. And instead of them being open to the gospel, there is such a hardening of people's hearts right now. And hallelujah, the belief that life begins at conception and saving whatever with fetuses, I'm praising God because I love life and God absolutely affirms life at every aspect. But at the sake of hardening all these hearts towards Jesus, I just don't know what to do with that, and it worries me. And I'm sad about that because there's like this bitterness that's taking root among people right now. And it breaks my heart. And I think it breaks Jesus' heart too. So how do we move forward as God's people in this world when things feel so polarizing? Yeah.
Isn't that what Paul is saying here in verse 8?
Yeah, I thank God.
He's basically saying your faith is spoken throughout the world. And I haven't even met all of you. Your faith is spoken. And then, like the person that zoomed in, she goes right to the heart of what he's sharing here too, that about, the encouraging. And so Paul, right now I'm doing a study with a group of guys on Colossians. And so Colossians is like meaty, like Romans is. They're both very, very meaty. But what he does is he shares with us, encouragingly shares with us that you have faith. But hey, listen, take a look at this. And so that's where Paul hits Romans too. He hits the low places, but he's also looking with his intellect. Because he's so in depth in who Christ is and having an understanding of him, because he was over here on the side. He was the killer of Christians. Right. So then all of a sudden, he's this encouraging person. And then he has to break all of what they knew who Paul was, or Saul was, and to be able to share Christ, and he was able to do it. Yeah. And you mentioned the pastoral idea, the father approach, and that's what he does. He encourages, he builds up, he's like, you're doing great, but hey, listen, take a look at this. See what I'm seeing, and I want you to see it. And then when I come, and then if you've ever seen the movie, the Paul movie, it's like when he's in Rome, very intellectually, he turns heads of the low, the medium, the high places, because of his ability and his connection with the Spirit. And the Spirit allows him to do that. So I'm encouraged by what you're sharing. It's really cool. So, but we can take a dim approach to this world that we're in. Yeah. I mean, last week in one of our classes, it was the father, one of the fathers in the class was talking about his son is being encouraged because of Roe versus Wade. His wife has a feeling on it. We all have feelings, and it's how we approach those feelings and allow grace, mercy, peace, and the Spirit to move us through all of what's going on, and to have the mind of Christ. Because I firmly believe, as you're saying, that Christ, when he's in this place, and that's what I felt when I first came in here, there's a Spirit alive and well. Yeah. My note was to the song leader, and to the spirit that's in this room, which is awesome. And we're from Texas, so we're not, we're from a red state, but you know what? Christ is alive and well no matter where we're at. So it's awesome to hear what you're sharing. So, but Paul's an encourager first and foremost, and every single letter that he wrote to the churches, no matter what church, whether it was Philippi or Colossae or to the region, it was all about encouraging. But then he was like, I gotta hit you between the eyes. You gotta see what I see that Christ can bring to your lives. Yeah. Whether you're in high, low, medium, slow, high places, low places, he can change lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
Thank you for that. Yeah, the truth that God, that Paul brings in the midst of his encouragement. Yeah, Beth.
I just wanted to say thank you for singing loud enough that I heard that
Oh.
you guys were here. This is a pretty new church.
The building is new, yeah.
The building is
Yeah.
new. And I just feel really grateful because I am not raised in faith or any faith.
Yeah.
And I'm on my journey toward becoming a Christian, contemplating it,
Praise God.
And I just feel really grateful that you guys have a very compassionate, welcoming space. Mm-hmm. And when you come into, when you're not in a faith and you walk into a church and it's, super harsh, it's really, it's so easy to turn away. Yeah. And there's so much good that it's, I feel really grateful that you guys are having this really compassionate space, and I think that more people will just walk in and be like, I actually feel peace being here, and I don't feel instantly shamed or turned away. And there's so much good that can kind of, like you're saying, get minimized by the few bad things that get portrayed about Christianity. And if you're not raised in the faith, that can be all you see.
Yep.
Because it's so big in politics and every day. And you're going to miss out on so much goodness and so many kind people. And I really hope that your flock grows and that you guys have a lot more people come in, and I think you will, because this is a great, I was going to the co-op, so I can't wait to come back. So thank you. And thanks for your sermon. I think it's really cool that you're open to talking about things that are really hard and current.
Yeah. Gosh, thanks for that. I'm really encouraged by that. Yeah, that was really glad you're
Because of what has happened this week, I've been really struggling to still call myself a Christian because the Bible is people are using the Bible as a weapon. So it's been hard to be loving and still publicly say that I'm still a Christian, because people are using it for hate and despise and stuff like that. And I'm, as part of another community, I want to be a safe space always, but I'm afraid that if I also tell them that I'm a Christian, that it would not create that space for them. It would create doubt and all that stuff. I still call myself a Christian, but I've been hesitant to do it in public lately because of the people that have used the Bible as a weapon against.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Rose. I think a lot of people are feeling what you're feeling as well, and it makes it a little complicated. It's almost like we have to take back the word or something. But yeah, I appreciate all of your thoughts, everybody. I know that there's a lot going on emotionally, and the beauty of a church that can feel safe is that we can hear from each other, that we can encourage each other, but we're not complacent in it. We're not just huddled up together at least we're safe, or at least we're the right Christians, or pat ourselves on the back. That's not what Paul is wanting to express here. This letter is to people that could not see eye to eye for the life of them. They were Christians that were Jewish Christians who believed fully that you had to worship God in a very specific way or God would not be pleased. And there were Gentile Christians who believed that God was allowing freedom in their lives, and they didn't have to do the things that the Jewish Christians did. And those two groups could not see eye to eye. And they were willing to split ways. They were willing to have separate services, have the contemporary service and the traditional service, or whatever it is, just to make it work for them. And Paul was saying there's another way forward. There's another way forward through Christ. And I believe it's possible. And so that's what this entire letter is about. And the reality is that 300 years after Christ's death and resurrection, the most powerful nation and government in the known world began allowing Christianity to exist peacefully. And that was a beautiful thing. To allow Christianity, to allow Christians not to be martyred left and right, not to be killed for their faith, not to be hunted in the streets. Constantine became a follower of Jesus. He gave his life over to the Lord. And in that way, which, hallelujah for that in many ways, he believed the best thing to perpetuate the good news was through giving church leaders a certain amount of governmental power and influence. And instead of Christianity staying in those spaces at the floodplain and in the places of margins and vulnerability and difficulty and suffering, instead of Christianity being a faith of compassion and grace, what we saw was it began to find comfort and protection towards the top, which can be incredibly corruptible. Because Jesus never intended people to come to him through force or through coercion, but through experiencing the truth of their belovedness, that Jesus is so absolutely infatuated with you, that Jesus loves you so tremendously. And that love is what brings us to a place of repentance and change. Not coercion, not manipulation, not the threat of hell behind you, but truly the love of Christ is what compels us towards living in a way that's different from the rest of the world. This letter that Paul wrote to these churches, it was incredibly pastoral because he knew it had to be rooted in the pastoral nature. He knew that things were difficult in Rome for people, that the circumstances were really hard, that they were fighting each other back and forth all the time. But Paul knew that a new perspective was possible. And this new perspective of Jesus as Lord, that means everything else not being Lord, all the personal preferences, all the ways that I believe that I have the right way of worshiping God and you're getting it wrong, becomes secondary to the affirmation that Jesus is Lord of our lives. And every time that we make ourselves Lord, Jesus is not. Every time we make our personal preferences Lord, Jesus is not. And Paul is saying, no. Get your focus on the right thing. Get it off yourself. Place it on Jesus. And in those spaces, you can find enough commonality to let go of the rest of it and begin walking in faithfulness with God. It's not something that happens overnight, friends. This is not something that we just wake up one day and we're like, oh, cool, I'm good with everything all the time. No, we still have our opinions, we still have our beliefs, and those beliefs might be really important, but our convictions that Jesus is Lord is what guides us first and foremost. And all those other things slowly become secondary, but it does take patience and so much grace for yourself and for your neighbor. As you were saying, when he was Saul, before he encountered Christ on that road to Damascus, he was coming from a place of political and religious power and influence. He held a certain amount of religious authority that gave him the right, what he believed was his right, to police the people, to make sure that they were living out the ways of God in the way that he understood God wanted. And he felt like he was doing the right thing by threatening violence and incarceration if people didn't live into what he believed that God was God's standard of living. After he encountered Christ, though, he purposefully and intentionally left those places of power behind. He went into a place of worshiping Jesus with other people at the bottoms of society. Paul understood what salvation finally meant. It wasn't some sort of like pie in the sky after you die or some sort of heavenly bliss that we're waiting for, but that salvation looks like the healing of God, the healing of relationships through God that happens immediately, but that continues forth. You were saved. You are being saved. You will continue to be saved. It is a progression that we live into as people. And so Paul understood that salvation would change everything for people, that repairing of relationship within yourself, within each other and within God, that healing of those relationships has the potential to stop evil in the world, and it feels just like freedom. Salvation is the reparation of broken things. It is an ongoing process that bears more and more fruit for us as Jesus people. I'm going to end here in just a minute. Oh, Jay, yeah.
Just one more.
We can't forget our history. The church's power grab is not a new thing. It usually starts from good intentions, knowing that how can we oppose or live differently in a way that opposes this kind of power and instead embrace downward mobility. Yeah, I love that downward mobility. Yeah, it's not a new thing. This is, yeah, we've always wanted more and more and more, but it's like so what the enemy tries to convince us of. And honestly, our witness of the gospel message in a lot of ways has been tainted in the world. It's been tainted all along in many ways. In other ways, it's been absolutely beautiful. We're able to keep our focus on Christ, and it brings healing to the nations. I truly believe that the church is the hope of the world. I believe that Jesus instilled the church because Jesus believes in the church to do good things, that Christ believes in us, that Christ trusts us to do the work of the Father in this world. Even when we don't trust ourselves, or especially when we don't trust the church down the street, Christ is still so trusting of all of us to do this work. The dominant message of Christianity lately has looked a lot like Christian nationalism, where money and greed move mountains, where there is an agenda to change the political landscape of our country while stomping on the suffering in the process. It looks a lot like excuses and not much accountability. And it feels like an impossible monster to combat against in some ways. So how do we come against the appealing lie that says that change comes from the top down? I think it's when we stay near the bottom. Like by finding the homes in those floodplains and pastoring there. Peter says that we are all a priesthood of believers. We are all called to be pastors for people. It might not be something that you're paid for, but we are all called into that sort of way of living, that as disciples of Christ, we are discipling other people in the ways of Jesus. We get to pastor people, and part of pastoring people is knowing our neighbors and working for justice on their behalf and with them. It's hearing stories of suffering and rejoicing in those things, the stories of celebration. It's by witnessing about the life-changing love of God that has brought you hope when you felt totally hopeless, that has brought you joy when you felt absolute despair, that has brought you grace when you felt the guilt and shame of the things that you have left undone in your life, that has brought you freedom from that shame, the shackles of that shame, that has brought you mercy when you felt like you did not deserve forgiveness. We are not ashamed of that gospel, friends. We are proud to be able to proclaim the gospel of God's resurrection power that brings salvation to everyone who believes. And this can be hard work, friends, but you're not alone in it. We are not alone in this hard work, okay? Don't think of yourself as like, well, I need to do better for myself. This is a work that we do together. And here in a minute, we're going to pray out our prayer of confession. And I want you to notice that this prayer of confession isn't a prayer for yourself. I mean, it is, definitely. We are called to live lives marked by confession and repentance as individuals. We are called by Jesus to come and die to our personal preferences or our quest for social status or our desire to stay at the top. We are called to die to those things, to let those things within us die. So we confess that before the Lord as individuals, but it is a confession of commonality, of plurality, because it is a confession of the church. So when we confess this prayer out, we are confessing on behalf of the church the ways that we have neglected our neighbors, the ways that we have sought power and influence as a church, the way that we wanted to become a great mega church on the street corner or whatever it is that makes us feel like we're finally doing something right. We confess that before God together as a community. And from that, we receive the forgiveness and grace of Jesus once again.